Today we're asking the questions, are stupid voters a progressive virtue? So, if we're going to talk about the idea of progressives and whether they desire strongly to have stupid voters as part of their voting base, we need to kind of look at the progression of voting rights and then put it in the context of progressivism. First things first, natural rights versus civil rights. There is a difference. Natural rights I've talked about in a previous video explaining what rights are, and I'll try to put a link up there for that. So the primary difference between natural rights and civil rights are natural rights exist no matter what. It doesn't matter if a government says you have them or not, they exist. They're just there. So, for instance, your right to free speech, your right to keep and bear arms, those are natural. The government can pass all the laws they want against them. Those rights still exist no matter what. You were born with them. Civil rights, on the other hand, are rights that are granted to you by society. Things you're either expected to do as a member of society or something you're granted almost like a privilege. Voting is a civil right. It's not a natural right. So, how does this come about? Well, of course, our foundation is English in nature, so it comes out of English tradition. So, when they first started having their very first representatives, which started occurring in the mid 1400s, they decided that the people who could vote for representatives were people who could be taxed. I believe the amount was anyone who was taxed 40 shillings or more in a year was allowed to vote. It was looked at as, since government is spending your money, you should have some kind of say-so in it via being able to vote for a representative who theoretically is telling you what they're going to be doing with the budget that year. So that's where our initial concept, at least in the Western English-speaking world, comes from in terms of how voting works. It was a civil right granted to you, basically saying if you're being taxed, you should have some form of say in how those taxes are being spent. Now, British America saw an expansion of voting because our tax rates were ridiculously low. Very few people got taxed. I've seen generally the figures in America at that time for British America were well under 2%. So some people never saw taxes, and what people did get taxed was relatively minimal. So this would cause each different colony, eventually state, to come up with a different set of rules for who they thought should be voting. In some cases, it was still taxpayers only. Some cases it was landowners. Some cases, landowners and taxpayers. And some colonies and states had broader forms of suffrage, where different groups would be allowed voting rights regardless of their land or tax status. And generally, this was to expand voting to the merchant class if they weren't necessarily landholders. So revolutionary America drastically changed the idea of this franchise because the idea of no taxation without representation was definitely at the forefront of the thought process. But also they were trying to think, how do we come up with it? Because the exact form of government we were going to hadn't been fully decided. Essentially, revolutionary state governments formed before the Articles of Confederation and well before the Constitution. So these revolutionary forms of government came up with revolutionary forms of representation and voting. So you saw huge differences between each state based on how they thought things were coming in terms of who needed to be represented in the voting process. So some saw very widespread suffrage, and some of them kind of stayed back to their roots in terms of landowners and taxpayers. one of the big things that comes out of this period is the idea of democracy. Okay, so understand that virtually all the people who would end up in the Second Continental Congress, and probably most of them that ended up at the Philadelphia Convention, were people who were classically trained in the English idea of how Greek, Roman, and other ancient governments had worked. So, I mean, it's essentially these ancient governments saw through an English lens transmitted to the academics and thinkers of that age. And at that point in time, pure democracy was looked at in a very low manner. It was believed that all democracies eventually self implode. Thus, we never were set up as a pure democracy, and there was a lot of reluctance of expanding the franchise too widely, lest we become a democracy and self implode. So there was this incredible balance between the idea of open democracy being a general bad good and the idea of democratic institutions being a check against elitism and a establishment becoming too populated by elites. So this was the balancing act that was attempting to be played out. We would see this act partially laid out in the Articles of Confederation, but it was seen in general that the revolutionary governments, in terms of their democratic franchises, had gone too far. They saw what a lot of the establishment at that point saw what was going on in the individual states as excesses of democracy. So, right before the Constitution gets signed, there's kind of a retrenchment in most of the revolutionary state governments where they readjust their governments for the post-war age. And these governments are a lot less democratic and a lot more Republican, and using the terms as they're literally used, not in the goofy way we use them to describe our political parties today. So when I say Democrat, people who favored greater democracy, whereas Republicans were people who favored a rule system republic of government. So the takeover of the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Party essentially put the brakes, and also the changes of the revolutionary state governments to post-revolution governments, put the brakes on the democratic movement. So definitely avoided an expansion and probably rolled back a little bit on the franchise. So then we get to Jeffersonian democracy. And Jefferson had really interesting ideas that would probably be a whole video on their own, of the idea of the American farmer as being this critical person in the setup of the United States. It goes back to the idea of initially the disinterested man, and Jefferson hoping that the disinterested man who existed in England and did not really exist in America could be replaced by the yeoman farmer, the farmer who essentially was self-sufficient but putting out very little excess. And so Jefferson's democracy, his idea was that all landowners, regardless of whether they're making any wealth or not, were part of his democratic expansion. And so that's what we see coming out of Jefferson. Now, what happens between Jefferson and Jackson considers himself the natural heir to Jefferson, is the idea that they need to expand the voting franchise further. The fear of elitism got very high by the time Jackson becomes president, and they see the solution to it as expanded democratic franchise. So by the time Jackson is done being president, pretty much all the states have adopted that all white adult males are essentially have the right to vote. And this was done at the individual level, not at the federal level. Now, we start seeing the beginning of women's suffrage as early, and there's probably some instances earlier, but the more important foundations are laid in like the 1840s. Obviously, it's going to take a long time before this actually takes root. To understand this part of expanding the franchise, this is a liberal impulse. And do understand I make a huge distinction between liberalism and progressivism. Liberalism is the idea of trying to expand the freedom of the individual. And so in this context, liberals are looking at the expansion of the voting franchise from landowners and tax holders, or landowners and taxpayers, to all males as a liberating experience. Essentially, all members of society are being recognized as having part of a say-so in what's going on and how their government works. So the liberal mindset at that point naturally says, well, women are impacted by government as well. Shouldn't they be able to vote? And we'll get into the progressive mindset shortly. Okay, so then we have the Civil War comes about. Shortly after the Civil War, essentially the adult male suffrage is spread to all adult males, regardless of their skin color. So all adult males are technically by law allowed to engage in voting. The civil right has been expanded. The Civil War also gives us the birth of progressivism. So we need to understand progressivism's formation a little bit to understand where it came from, to understand where it's going. So the progressives were, for the most part, the children of abolitionists from the Civil War. Essentially, they came to the conclusion that liberalism, general individual liberty and freedom, laissez-faire markets were too slow and too clunky in their ability to bring about progress and change. They looked at slavery in America and said, if it wasn't for the Civil War, slavery would have just kept going for a long time afterwards. So therefore, the Civil War was good, regardless of how much carnage it caused along the way, because the end result was slavery ended. So progressives came up with the idea that the application of government power by the right people could create better and faster progress in terms of making society a better place. So they, in a lot of ways, the ends justifies the means. If you get what you want in the end, it doesn't matter what comes along with it as baggage. So a critical part of progressivism is the idea that government can be the mechanism that improves everything, or actually will be. But you have to have the right kind of people with the proper education sitting in control of these various government boards, government bureaus, government divisions, wherever it's at. Whoever's doing the management of society or the economy, it's got to be the right people. Now, so this is just a quick contrast of progressivism versus liberalism. The liberals were concerned only with increasing the liberty and freedom of the individual. And for the most part, they were okay with the speed things happen. They just understood that it took time. Progressives, on the other hand, aren't as concerned with the individual as they are concerned with society as a whole. So they weren't, whereas the liberal would look at slavery and say it's horrible that that person is a slave. Progressives would say it's horrible, it's a horrible blight on our society that slavery exists. So you end up having different logics in how things need to be resolved from that. So progressivism is very elitist in nature. One of the things that progressives were very pro-WASP. They were virulently anti-Catholic, and they were very much against immigrants who were not from the English Isles. And, well, of course, the Irish, of course, were also filth and nastiness to them. And one of the things progressives recognized is that they were, if you basically took all those other groups and said they're not us, the WASPs were rapidly becoming in the minority. So that leads us to progressivism and women's suffrage. So when progressivism was starting to grow and make its way, and they were succeeding in the ways they wanted, they also became major proponents of women's suffrage. And the reasoning behind it was they believed that in general, the enlightened progressives, the WASPs, when their women were given the right to vote, that they would know how to properly vote and they would all turn out to vote. Whereas when we look at how the progressives viewed the non-WASPs, they believed that they were too tradition bound, that most of these women would not turn out and vote. So their goal was to swamp the system with progressive WASP women who would overwhelm essentially the non-WASP population because they wouldn't let their women vote. At least that's the theory they had. So the expansion of suffrage has both a democratic viewpoint, essentially being anti-elitism, anti-establishment. It has a liberal component, or it's the idea of expanding the civil rights to be fair to everybody who's affected by government. And it has a progressive element, where it's expanding the voter base to help swamp the voter base with your voters to make sure you win. So that kind of brings us closer to modern times. So originally, the idea of an absentee ballot was a ballot for somebody who, just for good reasons, could not be there during the election. These are people who planned ahead. They were generally either people in the military, people who would be abroad for either business or college, or people who knew they were going to be away from their polling station for the election. So these are people who thought ahead. They said, geez, voting is really important. I want to make sure I can vote. They had to go down to their county clerk and say, I need an absentee ballot application. And so these people were planning ahead to make sure that their ballot showed up where they were, no matter where they were. And then they had to send it out on time to get it back to the county clerk. So you have to say that at least there's a minimum amount of intellect involved. You have people who realize they're not going to be there for the election, realize they're going to be someplace else, take the time to go out and get the absentee ballot application, and then make sure it returns on time through the mail back to the polling station to be counted. Okay? To me, sounds like people who are deeply invested in outcomes and have enough intellect to understand what's going on. But then we expand the idea to no excuse voting, where anyone can apply for an application because they're like, oh, well, I don't feel like standing in line and I don't feel like being there on a particular day. I don't have to have an excuse. I'm not really all that concerned about showing up for this, and I'll probably send my thing in and hopefully get it done on time. And then it expands to universal mail-in ballot, where it's like, okay, we're going to send out applications to every single person who can fog a mirror, people who fall into the class of people who don't have enough care about what's going on to actually even go fill out a form. It has to be physically sent to them before they'll even consider filling it out. So the question being is this really the voter class you want voting for you? It doesn't lean towards the idea that this group of people is a group that's an intellectual powerhouse. Okay, so let's take it a little bit, a step slightly in a different direction, but it's basically talking about the same thing. So we do have a fairly large group of people in this country that are interested in politics. They either read mass media or they research things online and they try to understand issues. And whether they get them right or wrong, they are actively seeking information. And also, this could go to people who like, okay, I'm going to watch the news tonight to find out what the issues are. So, what is the appeal of mass media advertisement during the election season? Well, if you look at the ads, for the most part, nothing remotely intellectual can be said about them. They're very emotion-based driven. They're marketing. Essentially, it's a war of marketing. Who can come up with a thing that causes the biggest emotional response that'll stick in someone's brain to say, well, I don't remember exactly what they were saying, but I'm pretty sure that guy's the bad guy and that guy's the good guy. Is that really the group of people we want to appeal to? Is this the people we want driving things? And that leads to the next question. Is there any intellectual bar we are willing to set in terms of a voter? Is there any point where you say, this person just doesn't understand what's going on to the point where they probably shouldn't be enticed to vote? If they can figure out how to show up, they should, but let's not entice them since they're not even bothering to understand what's going on. So, and here's where I see a huge split in the logic. So on one hand, progressivism is this thing where, their idea is the greatest intellect of the nation should be sitting on these various boards that control and oversee things and decide how things run. Yet at the same time, they think it's a great idea to court the intellectual dregs of society to be part of the voting base. And this seems to be a massive inconsistency, other than if you look at it in terms of the ends justifies the means. So I guess that leads to some final questions, which I hope you'll consider discussing in the comment section below. Should there be some kind of intellectual bar set? What should it be? Should voting be harder? Should there be excuse-only voting in terms of getting an absentee ballot? Should voting only be in person? And maybe for a big throwback, maybe should voters only be taxpayers or landholders? Discuss below, please. Please smash the like button. If you think someone would find this content interesting, please share it with them. And if you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. It helps out my channel a lot and keep you in tune with things that are coming out as they come out. Well, thank you for spending time with me. Hope to see you again in a future video.